I do want to introduce Dr. Terry Messmer, who is a professor and extension wildlife specialist in the Department of Wildland Resources at Utah State. And then there's some stuff about his honors, which I'm sure we're all excited about.
Yes.
Honestly, no, I worked with Terry for quite a long time, and one of the things about Terry is that I've been always astonished with his energy as an extension wildlife person, his breadth of interest, and his ability to make things happen on the ground. And so that's a really important thing that I think he's going to tell us about in his talk about using community-based conservation approaches to restoration of sagebrush.
Weren't we going to arm wrestle first, Mark? An arm wrestle?
No.
Okay. Anyway, I'm rolling up my sleeves. A week or so ago, I was down in southern Utah at a Utah prairie dog field day. Utah prairie dog field day, and that's pretty unusual given when you talk about the history of Utah prairie dogs, and the species was listed in 1973 as endangered, now listed in 1978, and it's kind of been one of those species out there that exists primarily on private land. And the recovery plan, ironically, was written from the standpoint where only those prairie dogs that are on federal land actually are credited towards recovery. But anyway, I ran into the local chairman of the Fremont River Soil Conservation District, and he told me a story. He said he told me a story about a elementary school when he was in elementary school, and he said that usually in elementary school, what the teachers did is they allowed the students to do something fun if they completed the assigned task on time or ahead of time. And so a lot of times, kids would really work hard to get it done, and then they would have free time. And in his particular case, they had drawing time, and that was the favorite of a lot of the kids in his class. And so one particular day, the students completed their tasks, and they got done on time, and they had this drawing time. And so the teacher went around to each of the students and was visiting with them and what they were doing, and she came up to this one student, and the student was drawing this picture, and she said, "Well, what are you drawing?" And the student, quickly perked up and responded, "I'm drawing God." And the teacher said, well, that's good and fine, but no one really knows what God looks like. And the student responded, "They will after I get my picture done." Okay. And so oftentimes when we think about things and we say we don't know or we can't accomplish this, I think in a lot of ways we're probably selling ourselves short. And one of these buttons moves this screen, right?
Yeah, the one that's on the right-hand side.
On the right-hand side. Okay. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about is an effort going on range-wide, and I think it's a very critical effort. A lot of the literature talks about adaptive management, but I will argue in wildlife and range management there are very few examples of adaptive management in practice. There are very few. Adaptive management implies that there's some learning that is going on, that is causing people to change the way they do things based on what they learned from actions they've done in the past. And unfortunately, history repeats itself. There are mistakes that were made decades ago that we're still making. And we think there's a way to address this, to account for this. And this is through community-based conservation. I'm going to talk about this in a series of different steps. Here's essentially my outline. We're going to talk about the landscape out there, the Sagebrush Steppe. What is the community? We're going to talk about some of the changes that have happened out there. We're going to talk about this word collaboration. What is this? What is collaboration? What is it? What does it mean? And then I'm going to give you a process that we've embarked on in Utah, and then some of the implications of that process in addressing sage-grouse. But this is the landscape, and you've seen this through the course of the day. Steve Nick showed this, and Cameron showed this, and other people showed it. And essentially, this is Sagebrush Steppe. It's unique. Unique characteristics. It's a mosaic of private and public land ownership. The figure thrown out today that about 70% of the Sagebrush Steppe is public land. Well, in Utah, most of the Sagebrush Steppe, the majority of it is privately owned. About 40% is privately owned. And so that's an interesting figure when you look at public ownership and things along that line. But one of the interesting thing about this landscape is the community, the character, the nature of the community, and the land uses co-evolve. They share certain similarities. And I think that's one of the things that, in the process of looking at system restoration or system function, a lot of scientists overlook. Who is this community? And here's some bullet phrases about who the community is. It's unique. It's mosaics. Utah, for example, you think of Utah as really being a rural state, but really it's the 6th most urbanized state in the country in terms of where our population lives. And so those demographics make a big difference on how people look at things. The community is poor yet rich. Poor in terms of maybe traditional land uses, rich in terms of potential. You saw the picture today about the Jonah field in Wyoming and the demand on energy and the 47,000 oil and gas wells. But again, this is part of the community. It's also a community of place and a community of purpose. When I talk about a community of place, is that those are the people that live and work and need to exist in that community, that have essentially evolved with the community and its land use. And the community of purpose is those activities that go on there. This last photograph on the bottom is actually I-15, traffic on I-15, and you see the contrast in terms of the backgrounds, the irrigated farmland with the rangeland. It's also a community of contrast and a community of change. Okay? And this happens. I mean, there's some communities in Utah, rural communities I work that have 3 coffee shops, that have 3, Starbucks, Seattle's best type coffee shops, and so the demographics of the population are changing. And those are things that in looking at restoration and manage that system, again, I think as a scientific community we often overlook, we often ignore. There is, I will argue, there's probably a lot more sociology and biology than we want to admit. Okay, Sagebrush steppe. Here are some of the primary species that we're dealing with. We've talked about pygmy rabbit today, sharp-tailed grouse, Utah prairie dog I mentioned earlier. And again, the key thing here is a lot of this critical habitat for these species is on private land. Okay? Nationwide, when we look at endangered species, about 78% of endangered species occupy or occur on private land. Here's an interesting statistic. This is our reality. When I talk about our reality, it's the reality of wildlife managers and biologists. And in some ways, I think it's an indictment of our failure of the scientific community. Roughly about 1,200 some species listed. And this is as of March 2005. You look at the West, and again, some of these are, these are not additive. Several species occur in other areas, but folks, the Endangered Species Act has been around since 1973. It's now 2007, and there's a lot of species, both plant and animal, that are on that list. But the other part of the perspective is that it's more than just about endangered species. It's about that community. A survey conducted of agriculture producers a few years ago and asked what their number one concern is. Healthcare. Healthcare, affordable healthcare. About 80% of the people in this country have affordable health care. Health care alone is about 20% of our gross national product, our expenditure. Okay? So that's a big issue. So if a person is going to make a decision about conservation of species, a Utah prairie dog versus building something that will provide affordable health care for their family, they're going to make that other decision. Also, we got other issues on our mind. We've got issues about war, issues about poverty. 35 million Americans, according to the 2003 Bureau Census, live below the poverty line. Okay? There's poverty in rural Utah. There's poverty in Logan. There's poverty in Salt Lake. Other realities: a global economy, global demand, products coming from all over to keep that price low. The price of fuel goes up, and that has consequences when we talk about restoration. Think about how much habitat, how much rangeland you can restore when diesel fuel hits $5-6 an acre. Okay? And the trends of energy prices are going to continue to grow. And so some of the answer for what we're talking about in terms of restoration, in terms of sagebrush management, probably is historical. There are things that occurred on the landscape that we could probably learn from, that we could reduce some of these other carbon-intensive expenditures. Oh, let me back up. Okay, a new word, collaborative conservation. It came on the landscape here a few years ago, and everybody talks about collaborating, and this basically summarizes what it is. It's basically groups getting together in a community to solve and to do things themselves. To basically come up with solutions, to put aside their differences, and chart a course of action that leads to something productive, benefiting both sides. One of the newest partners in collaborative conservation, the oil industry. There's a big initiative now called the Sagebrush Conservation Initiative. Has anyone heard of that? Involving the idea of mitigation, the idea that we can go and we can do these types of things. And actually, this is not the field in Wyoming. This is an East Texas oil field here in 2005. But basically, energy is a big part of the American psyche right now. It's a big part of some of the problems we face when looking at sagebrush steppes. When we talk about collaboration has many faces. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was in a meeting with some landowners in Montana where we were talking about collaboration, looking at livestock raising, and one of the guys got up and said, that's a term I don't like. You know what they did with collaborators during World War II? They did that. And so essentially, if you look at a definition for collaboration in any dictionary, you'll find out it's working with the enemy. So that hasn't come out of our vocabulary yet, but it's very true, because a lot of these forces we see environmentalists versus conservationists versus sportsmen versus rancher. That's the idea of working with the enemy. It takes courage. It takes courage to take that step, to build that trust. Here 3 years ago, we had a Utah prairie dog workshop down in one of the southern counties, and we were talking about a little program called Safe Harbors. A program where, in fact, a landowner could receive dollars for doing things for prairie dogs that would be positive from the standpoint of prairie dogs and from the management of their particular piece of ground. One of the ranchers afterwards came up to me and he said, if one of my neighbors entered into that program, I'd burn his house down. Okay? Burn his house down. So that's this perspective of collaboration. I know there's probably not very many landowners or county commissioners or elected officials here at these meetings, but these are some of the things I think from a standpoint that we have to deal with. One of the things static about these environments is change. Things will constantly change. I have landowners come up to me and say, how many sage-grouse should we produce? How many do you want? Give us a number. We can't give you that number. That number doesn't exist. The number doesn't exist because the dynamics, the forces that change these environments are always acting. And so what was a good number today, 5 years from now may not be a good number. 10 years may not be a good number. But there's a renewal about collaboration. This is an advertisement about a White House conference a few years ago about cooperative conservation. And again, the focus is getting local communities together, local individuals, and to have them work to solve problems. But as part of this problem solving, science needs to be an important component of it. Not only in terms of charting the path, but also documenting the outcomes, and that's one of the things we need to do more work on. Here's the executive order, August 2004, which basically mandated that these departments under the President's Cabinet would work to promote cooperative conservation. In all their policies and all their actions, they're going to stress the idea of local participation. That's what we're going to do. We're going to work better. When we talk about conservation, we all learn about Gifford Pinchot's model of conservation. Gifford Pinchot was really an interesting guy. Very good at politics. He called for professional managers with the U.S. Forest Service, and so the system was set in place with the idea that we need professional managers to go out there and that are trained, that are equipped, that know what needs to be done, and essentially what they do is they guide the management. In other words, trust me. I've got the education. I know what needs to be done. Okay, but he also took some hits for his commercialization of the U.S. forests, national forests. On the other side, we've got Elder Leopold. Elder Leopold was more private landowner centric. The idea of indicating that private landowners, he looked across the country, are very important in this process. He feared that too much government intervention would actually be detrimental to conservation. That we needed to incorporate the experiential learning, the knowledge of the private landowners in this process, and also understand and appreciate the socioeconomics. And what has this got to do with sage-grouse? This last decade, I will argue, it should be called the decade of sage-grouse and conservation. And here's some of the dates, and I know there's a lot of dates out there, but the key thing that drove this system was in 1996, the Western State Sage-grouse and Sharp-tailed manager said, hey folks, we've got a problem. Sage-grouse numbers are declining range-wide, we need to do something. The states went about, they issued their strategic management plans, there were several petitions that were filed. Back in 2005, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said the petition is unwarranted because we're doing great things for sage-grouse. That was 2005. 2007 is a different universe, with the extensive energy development that's going on in Powder River and in Wyoming and things along that line. So I fully expect in the next year or so we probably will see another petition for sage-grouse. When managers look at a situation involving a species, an animal that's been impacted, what we typically try to do is we try to find out what are the bottlenecks, what are the problems causing that to happen. And what we do is we take that information and we apply it to management. We use science to understand the needs, the shortcomings, the biology, and the art of wildlife management is the application and how we paint it across the landscape, how we arrange it, how we position it, what's the configuration. Some of the management may be direct in terms of the removal of a predator, or indirect in terms of a habitat manipulation to make it maybe harder for that predator to get a Pacific prey species. In response to this, nationally, regionally, was a strong emphasis by Western governors as others to form these local working groups. What you see here is a mosaic of working groups in the Western United States focusing on sage-grouse conservation, and this also spanned into Canada. The idea here is that we've got about 63 of these groups that are given the opportunity, the chance, to try some things different, to essentially take control over their own destiny, to do some things good for sage-grouse and hopefully other sage-grouse obligate species. Typically when we look at local working groups, one of the metrics we look at is we want to evaluate the outcomes. In other words, your population was here before you started, and ideally we want it up here when we end. And that's what most of the organizations, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is interested in. The Fish and Wildlife Service in 2003 issued a policy called the Peace Policy, Policy for Evaluation and Conservation Actions regarding listing of species, and they're focused on the idea of environmental outcomes. Do we have more grouse now? Do we have more grouse habitat? Is this habitat protected? Are the risks reduced? Okay, but I'll argue there are other parts to this process. In terms of look at local working groups, one of the metrics should be the partners. In other words, how diverse are our partners? Are all our views expressed? Are local communities taking a role in that process? Are they taking ownership in that? Another metric is, do they have a plan? Do they have a plan? We all have a plan in life, but how many of us sit down and write that plan out? And then go back to that plan and follow that plan and check on our milestones. How many of us do that? Probably nobody, right? But this plan provides that metric. It provides that schedule of stepping stones on how you can accomplish these things and what you accomplish. It provides something you can report an objective against. Here are some of the metrics for success. Projects, habitat, predation. All too often, managers, whether they be range, wildlife, ecologists, whatever, measure success in terms of acres. Acres treated. And folks, that's going to cause us some problems. Because what's really important in this process is in terms of response to those acres treated. One other part that I will argue that's an important part of the local working group process, the community process, is the idea of learning. What have we learned? And I think that's where these processes have failed in the past. Is we go ahead and we try to address the situation by putting a Band-Aid on it, but we forget about the learning that needs to go on in the process. And that, I will argue, is more important than sometimes the environmental outcomes, because that results in sustainability. In Utah, we've got 13 local sage-grouse management areas. We've filed that down to about 12. We have 12 active groups in the state. 11 of those groups have completed plans. And what we've done is we've borrowed the Nature Conservancy Conservation Action Planning model. And we've forced the groups to make decisions about what are the risks, what are the threats, where do we want to be, where are we at right now. And in that way, that allows the group to establish priorities in terms of the projects they're doing. It allows them to measure their success based against the state of the general. In the last several years in Utah, we've had roughly about 1,000 projects completed in the state. Hundreds of thousands of acres. And we are doing some monitoring, but we're not doing the kind of level of monitoring that we need to address some of these specific threats, particularly when it comes to a population. But the local working groups are doing that through flagship projects. Each of the local working groups in the state of Utah is trying to develop a flagship project to address the risks. They do things, they do small projects, they learn from those projects, they take those projects and they apply those projects or what they've learned to a larger landscape. And effectively, they go from a small plot to treat a landscape area. They select different tools. In some cases, they maybe do nothing. When we look at sagebrush steppe environments, if we do a treatment out there and we essentially eliminate sagebrush canopy cover, it could be 30 years. It could be 30 years for that site to restore itself. I've seen far too many projects in the state that were done in the name of sage-grouse where there isn't any sagebrush left, folks. Any sagebrush that's measurable enough that should be supporting that population. Monitor the outcomes. The biggest issue. Monitor the outcomes. Monitor the response. In the local working groups, we're doing that. We're taking information when we do a specific treatment, and these are some data sets from Parker Mountain. When we go in and we do some things, we set up a good design, we do the replication, we do the experimentation, and we monitor the outcome. And here's a data set from Parker Mountain. We started back in 1997. Right now, Parker Mountain's estimated population about 6,000 birds. We started, it was about 600 to 700 birds. And it's a process of tinkering, doing things. When we did our first manipulation on Parker Mountain, we had a 5,000-acre pasture set aside, and the landowners wanted to go in and essentially get rid of everything. Well, we backed off and we treated just little plots, and we learned from those plots, and we applied those plots on a larger landscape. In 2002, Bioscience had an editorial which talked about the role of science and the role of management in these processes, and they talked about this plethora of local working groups getting started to address issues. And here's the role of science in the process identified in that editorial, and I agree with this wholeheartedly. Science is part of the process. Science provides the experimentation, it provides the mechanisms, the design to refute or prove a concept. But more importantly, it provides the mechanism to create new knowledge and then transfer that knowledge into new information that can be used to management. But ultimately, the scientists in this process need to lead from behind. All too often, we're doing science in absentia. When I say science in absentia, is we're not doing science where the local community can feel, they can smell, they can touch, they can see the research. All the published literature in the world doesn't make a hill of beans to someone out there in a community that's concerned about affordable health insurance. Community-based conservation. I think it's the way of the future. I think it's an area that we need to do more work into. I love this quote by Kenneth Galbraith, and it's really true. Anytime you're faced with a challenge in life, the first thing you want to say is, well, why do we got to do this? Why do we have to do this? And the bottom line is embracing change because change is inevitable. And in doing so, you take the first step in turning that challenge into an opportunity. Here's our website, utahcommunitybased-conservation-program.org. And one of our major partners in this effort is Nature Conservancy, and I need to give Nature Conservancy credit for the effort and the work we've done in using the Conservation Action Planning model. So That's all I have. Thank you.
We do have time for questions if people. Well, if I haven't broken the machine here.
And he pulled up a thing that said I was 10 minutes overdue. That's it. So hurry up, get done. Any questions? Yes, please.
Are you satisfied with how Utah Trust lands manage their property?
Am I satisfied with what, ma'am?
Utah Trust lands, how they're doing on managing their property as far as maybe restoration and rehabilitation projects?
That's a hard question because I don't know all the level of management Utah School and Administrative Trust Lands does on their property. Utah Trust Lands has a pretty unique mission in terms of what they're supposed to do in the state. But having said that, there are areas, for example, like Parker Mountain, which is state trust lands. And Parker Mountain state trust lands have been very, very receptive and very open to try different experimentation and different ways to look at management of the systems, including changing historic grazing regimes. And so in my experiences in working with trust lands on the areas we're dealing with Sage-grouse local working groups, I find trust lands to be very supportive of new ideas and very supportive of the experimentation. So statewide, I know there's criticism here and there, but in our experience in the local working groups, it's been very positive now. Please.
Having had the nice perspective of seeing the whole community-based conservation experiment start from the beginning and sprout into something that's been pretty successful statewide, and as you were mentioning, is in many ways a good model for future conservation efforts. I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on some of the challenges that you see in terms of scaling it up or making modifications to improve the process, and where you see it going in the future if you see it as this promising thing.
Thank you. That's a great question. All is not roses here. This is a lot of work. We started our community-based process in Utah in 1996 with Gunnison Sage-grouse. And why we started with Gunnison Sage-grouse is I talked to Clay Brown, who was just across the border in Colorado, and they had a group kind of going on in the Gunnison Basin. And I said, "Oh, Clay, let's just piggyback." And he said, "Oh, you're on your own." So anyway, I know Clay very well. But anyway, there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of struggles with that. And part of it is how do you sustain that process? And how we found you sustain the process and where we've had the greatest success is success. The Division of Wildlife Resources, to its credit, when it wrote the Strategic Management Plan for Sage-grouse in 2002, basically gave the responsibility for developing these local plans to the local communities. They gave ownership in the process to these communities. The division isn't overlooking their shoulders and saying, "No, you're wrong, you're right." It's basically for the group's opportunity and chance to prove themselves. But in doing that, there's difficulty oftentimes in maintaining the continuity and the information flow because there's a lot of different things going on in the landscape. This meeting, there's maybe one or two landowners maybe present at this meeting. Local working groups, we have typically a better showing, a better percentage, but still there's the issue of people making decisions and participating. But the difficulty is trying to sustain the process given all the distractions out there. And ultimately what we hope to do in the next 5-10 years is create a local ownership, a local leadership effort that will sustain that. But I think for these efforts to be effective in the long term, there needs to be some outside facilitation effort from some entity like an extension service or a university or some organization out there that's committed to helping that community succeed. Not deciding the answers for them, or making the decisions, but at least creating the venue for them to discuss it.